Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Caresoft on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Travis Rosick, the Chief Technology and Strategy Officer at Blue Vector. Now, Travis, before break, you opened the door for us to talk about why machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the like is so becoming more important for cyber defenders. So let's just start there. Why is it becoming more important, and how can they start to use that to, if you will, break through some of this big data problem that everyone's facing?
Yeah, absolutely. And great question. So artificial intelligence and machine learning applied to cybersecurity is really important for many reasons. Speed of detection, as we're seeing with the sophistication of cyber threat actors, the capability or ability for them to be more destructive in their motives and intents. In many cases, organizations aren't able to recover after a destructive type of malware attack. So the faster you can detect it, the faster you can mitigate or prevent the scale and the scope of the damage is incredibly important. So the machine learning piece of it really applies to that. So as we're seeing with reactive-based cybersecurity, security that relies heavily on signature detection. For targeted attacks, I think the half-life for a malicious sample is measured in seconds. So for a targeted attack, a signature is only going to be able to stop that attack, within the first minute or less. So they're going to recompile their tools and have an attack profile that there isn't a known signature for to block or mitigate it. So the evolution, from signatures, sandboxing was kind of the next evolution of non-signature based detection. But because that takes minutes or hours for cloud-based sandboxes or on-premise sandboxes to return results, it still isn't fast enough for destructive malware. So the application of machine learning allows that analysis of unknown content to be rendered, and a decision about whether it be benign or malicious can occur in milliseconds, but which is timely enough to be actionable and minimize that impact. Also, going back to, I mentioned earlier in the conversation, every SOC, Security Operations Center, is drowning in events. And, trying to figure out how you do alert prioritization, you can automate some of that work by leveraging machine learning. So Blue Vector's been working on some research projects and productizing this new capability around automated threat hunting, which does some of the automatic triage of events and data to help do some of that better prioritization. And that's really the scale and the scope and the speed of cyber these days. Machine learning is going to be critical going forward. Now, you can't, I don't want to take away from, you have to have skilled analysts and people in the loop. It's uber critical. They just need to have these types of tools to be able to make them more effective.
I think the tools piece is so important, but as you mentioned, so is the workforce side. Is that maybe the biggest consideration agencies need to really keep in mind as they bring in these tools? Yes, it's great to have them and they can do so much, but if your folks can't use them, then what good are they? I mean, that's true for almost any tool, right?
Absolutely. So I think, some of the pain point that I experienced in my government career, and, that was on one side of the fence. Now as in the commercial world or as a vendor, I've seen the other side of the fence around the acquisition process. And as a govie and somebody on the procurement side of things, getting somebody in cyber operations to write technical requirements for procurement, it was almost like a prison sentence. It was, they felt like they were, they didn't have appreciation for the importance of that role. And I certainly didn't back in the day. And it was, an interesting dynamic, but essentially, if the requirements don't have the right level of technical specification and requirements, understanding of the problem, from a procurement acquisition decision perspective, it's really hard to evaluate what's good and bad. So understanding in that acquisition process, source selection, really understanding what machine learning is, for example, how do you even build a test plan and test it? So, for example, if you're really testing the effectiveness of machine learning, say for detecting malware, you can't go to a known repository of known malware and use that for testing, because that defeats the purpose. So, having test plans that are, legitimate and for these new complicated solutions is not trivial. So It's really important across the board.
The training, the acquisition side, I didn't think we were going to get into the acquisition side of this. So I'm happy to go down that path a little bit, but you're right. I mean, you can't have, you have to have the acquisition folks understand what they're buying, and the technical folks keep it simple enough that they understand what they're buying so they can make the good source selection decision. Are you seeing that starting to happen with government customers? Are you, when Blue Vector talks to your customers and others, do they recognize that both machine learning and artificial intelligence is really going to be helpful for us, but B, do we know how to use it? Are we prepared to use it? Are we prepared to buy
it? So I think it's a little bit all over the board. So, some fully understand it. I mean, there's organizations that can create malware on the fly. They can use that for testing. And then, that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is they don't really understand how the different types of machine learning and how they're applied to problems. It's a buzzword. So they think they're buying machine learning. From what I try to educate people is, you're buying a capability that just happens to have machine learning component that helps it do its job, right? But you're not. I'm going to go out and buy machine learning to solve cybersecurity. That's not really the right understanding of the technology or the application of the science.
Yeah, it's like we'll get to this in a minute, but zero trust. I'm going to go buy me some zero trust. That doesn't work that way.
Right. It's a concept. It's not a thing.
Exactly. You brought up this topic as well earlier, and I'm going to tag back to it, is the signature. Now, we've heard a lot of criticism over the years of the DHS Einstein program because it's too signature based. And I think some of that's a misunderstanding of what Einstein's supposed to be, but we won't go down that path. But a lot of the cyber world is focused on the signature. And you're right, signature is very reactive. And for agencies to be more proactive, that also opens the door to the threat intelligence sharing. What are you seeing around these two kind of long-term challenges around cybersecurity, is understanding the signatures, but also then sharing them more quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think have been on both sides of the fence, security operator, practitioner, and then on the pro services and vendor side of the world. Yeah, I've seen it, from different angles, public and private sector. So from a threat intel signature-based sharing, I mean, it's the fastest way to detect a threat. It's the most surgical way to detect a known threat and have context about it. The challenge is the adversaries have changed over the last several years, such that they create tools and capabilities that evade signature-based detection. And many times they have ways to get access or test against tools to see if they will even be detected or not before they use them in the wild. So trying to create signatures, it's kind of like fighting the last battle or the last war, right? So I kind of use the analogy or scenario that, this type of mitigation is like driving your car by only looking in your rearview mirror, right? And the attempt is to dodge potholes. So in that reactive world, so some of the things actually in one of the meetings and presenting with the Cybersecurity Solarium Commission, I provided some feedback that, security programs in general need to be more proactive and less reliant on the signature, straight up signature sharing, right? Being able to share things that have longer half-lives than a regular signature for like a file hash or something like that is really what's needed going forward. So for example, if the government organizations worked with industries, they could create machine learning classifiers for malware. For example, Blue Vector's machine learning engines can detect threats without updates for years in advance. So they can create signatures or tailor them for specific environments. And those things have a half-life of months, if not years. So sharing things like that from public to private sector, where the half-life is much longer than 50 some seconds that targeted attacks and malware signatures last today, is really the battle we should be facing, right? That's driving your car looking through the front windshield. And you're going to be much more successful dodging potholes.
And the signatures are still valuable, but because a lot of times, I think it was something like I heard 80% of the time, the hackers are going after known holes because people don't patch them. But it is also looking forward to know what's the next thing that they're going after that I need to be aware of. Travis, I want to switch this over to zero trust because I think that's the buzzword we're hearing across a lot of government and the private sector, the move to zero trust. Just give me some initial thoughts on where agencies are heading, and not just why it's important. I think we know why, but how can they actually achieve that type of architecture?
Yes, no, absolutely. So as your earlier comment, it's, it's not a thing, it's a concept or process. You can't buy it in a box. So, there are a lot of practical challenges of implementing zero trust architecture at large scale. But it's, in essence, the principle is, you don't trust the users in your environment or the systems. You have to put them through a lot of scrutiny before you give them access to data. Validating if they have the need to know or have the right to access that data as well. So, there's a lot of moving parts in a large architecture like this. It has a lot of complexity. I think just fundamentally, a lot of organizations maybe don't know how many, in my experience, they don't know how many systems are on the network. When the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff asked how many computers are on the DoD networks, and it was, plus or minus tens of thousands, right? So, looking at that problem many years ago, we've gotten much better there. But from a zero trust perspective, it's a similar type of challenge. Where's the data on those systems? What's the content of that data? And then what user should have access? So there's a lot of components around it. But I think validating identity before they have access to the data is definitely important. Continuous monitoring from a security perspective. If a system or a user account is compromised, they definitely prevent them from getting access. So a lot of great things in the principle and the architecture. But some of the gaps or some of the things that I've speak about is there's also malicious attacks occur by malware. So if the adversary can't get steal credentials or guess a password through social engineering, the other mechanism they're going to use for attacks is some kind of malicious code or malicious logic. So implementing zero trust architecture in an environment that's potentially compromised, that has a decades amount of data already in it. How much of that data is already compromised? How do you build trust in the data? So one aspect I think is overlooked with zero trust architecture is actually having trust in the data. So a trusted user or a trusted system, may check all the boxes from a policy enforcement perspective, but the data they're sending me, must be extra scrutinized and go through something that, if a trusted user can easily send me a spearphished email with something malicious or, some other mechanism. So I think the data aspect of zero trust is something that doesn't get enough attention, and I feel that it should.
I think those are points that we could talk much more longer about, but unfortunately, Travis, we are out of time for today. So let me thank my guest. Travis Rosick is the Chief Technology and Strategy Officer at Blue Vector. Travis, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Jason. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.